In this video, I'm going to talk to you about how to wrap up your paintings. Up to this point, you have drawn and blocked in your colors, then you've gone back over the surface of your painting and made subtle modifications, correcting the shapes of the color blocks and the colors themselves. You've even added a little more nuance to color blocks, applying subtle changes in color temperature, value, and possibly saturation. You've adjusted your edges to match what you're seeing in the still life, and all this is building up to a more opaque surface that is generally nicer to look at. That is to say, higher levels of craftsmanship. And you've done it by keeping your brush strokes short, modeling the form, making objects look more dimensional, and creating the illusion of a three-dimensional space. Because I'm right-handed, I'm going to start in the upper left corner and move my way over and down, looking for little areas to finish up. If you're left-handed, I suggest starting in the upper right corner so you don't smudge or smear the wet paint. To begin, I'm using all of my smallest brushes. One for light warm colors, one for dark warm colors, one for light cool colors, and one for dark cool colors. I've pre-mixed a lot of the same colors I've used in the past, knowing that I will have to mix more as I discover them. In fact, for this painting, I'm actually reusing most of the colors I mixed in the second layer. I just remixed some of the colors that had dried. So all that's left are the final details. There will likely be more time spent correcting color blocks and adding subtle nuances to certain areas, but you'll also be adding the details, which are the really small features of the objects. In this case, we're talking about the strings that wrap around the bags, the folds in the fabric, and the texture on the stick. At this stage, the viewer should already understand the lighting, the texture, and the dimension, so now you're just going back and giving them the extra mile, the detail, the small visual elements and subtle nuances. You will probably find that at this stage, your face gets a lot closer to your painting. This step is the quickest to complete. I'd say it's probably only about 10% of your entire painting time, maybe a little bit more depending on how you paint, and there isn't a lot of new advice to give to you. You're essentially doing all the same things you did in the second layer, but you're working on a smaller scale. Instead of painting large shapes, you're just painting small shapes. Because of the shift in scale, your brain, your eyes, and your hands will be working a little bit differently, but all the same concepts apply. You're still looking for blocks of color, and you're using the paint and your small brushes to mimic them in your painting. The blocks of color just happen to be much smaller this time. You're probably well aware of all the details that you need to paint in. You've probably been tempted to paint them in many times already during the painting process, or maybe you've been looking forward to getting them in, but take your time, go slow. The details are the parts that really make your painting look good, but there are still probably some areas that need very subtle corrections. As you move around the surface of your painting, look at the still life, bounce your eyes back and forth between your painting and the still life, and try to find all the minor differences between your painting and the still life. You'll probably find there's quite a few things that still need to change. Do this as you continue to work on the details. So if I were to give you any new advice, it might just be to concentrate a little harder and stay focused. Although the process is technically the same, the change in scale can be confusing and does require you to think a little bit differently. But again, you're just looking for specific color blocks and you're copying them. Take your time, go slow, be careful. If you mess up, you can always wipe it out and try again or paint over it after it dries. If you're really struggling to understand what's going on in the fine detail areas, you can try taking a picture of the area in question, zoom in on it, and re-examine it. That might help you understand what you're looking at. When you've looked at your painting for 5 to 10 hours, it's easy to get used to problem areas and overlook them. You can try holding your painting up to a mirror or take a photograph of your painting and then flip it in a photo editing application. Seeing the reverse image of your painting changes your perspective and can make you aware of things that maybe you've overlooked. After concentrating on an area for a while, step back, compare what you've done to the still life, essentially double check and triple check, so on, until you're satisfied. It doesn't hurt to get some feedback from someone else who knows how to paint, a peer, a teacher, but don't ask a parent or a friend. They'll tell you it's great, but they don't necessarily know what they're talking about, so I would not trust them. After you finish the painting and it's dry, you might go back over the brightest highlights and add a small amount of straight white paint. There isn't a lot of need for it in this painting because nothing's very reflective. However, if you're painting something like metal or glass or any highly reflective material like this set of silverware I painted a few years ago, it's probably reflecting some bright white highlights. It's not a bad idea in these circumstances to go back through with white paint straight from the tube and carefully apply it where it goes. For this fork and knife, I dragged straight white paint over the edges to make it stand out from the tabletop. Likewise, you could look at the dark areas and decide whether you need to knock them down a little bit with black. I always suggest using a mixed black. You can see that the blacks on the silverware are actually kind of warm, so if you applied black paint straight from the tube, it would look too cool. I mixed a warm black, painted it in, conferred with a peer, and I'm satisfied with it. So your painting will dry. If it's oil paint, it might take a few days or even a week, week and a half. If it's acrylic, it should be dry within a few hours, maybe a day at the most. The drying process is simply when the solvents evaporate out of your paint, leaving the paint film behind, which is made up of oil, sometimes synthetic oil, pigment, and your paint. When your painting is dry, you can touch it and it won't be tacky. At this point, it's ready to frame, sell, exhibit in a museum, hang on the fridge, whatever you want. However, acrylic and oil paint also go through a curing process. This is a chemical process in which the residual solvents have turned into gases, so when your paint dries, not all the gases have escaped yet. The curing process is the process by which those gases escape through the dried paint film. Depending on how thick your paint is, this can take anywhere from a few weeks to half a year. And if you use too much medium early on, your painting could potentially crack. After it's cured, you can apply a varnish. You can't tell when it's cured by looking, so I suggest waiting about 6 months before you varnish just to be sure. However, varnishing is not necessary. I do it sometimes I don't. It'll help protect your painting from dust, dirt, and grime, and varnish also gives your painting a nice even sheen across the surface, but it is certainly not vital. That's it. You can see the painting before I started the last layer and after I finished the last layer. They don't look that much different, but in the finished painting there are a lot more subtleties in the background and on the surface of the bags. The strings around the bags are a lot more clear. The paint has gotten more opaque in a lot of areas. The textures are a little bit more refined, and generally it's a better painting. So the more you look, the more you'll see the differences. So go slow, take your time, concentrate, confer with a peer or teacher, and you'll do great. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you need anything at all. Goodbye, friends.